Imagine being told, like, sorry, you can't lobby for your kid's education because the Constitution says so? Sounds kind of wild, right?
Yeah, it's a head-scratcher for sure.
But that's what we're dealing with in this case that might be going to the Supreme Court.
It is, this case, Jill Hile at Alvey, state of Michigan. And yeah, it could have some serious implications for, well, everyone, really.
So we've got all these legal briefs you sent over, and it seems like the big question is whether Michigan banning public funding for any private school, religious or not, violates the Constitution.
You got it. We've got the Hile families, and they've teamed up with this pro-school choice group, and they're petitioning the Supreme Court to, actually take the case.
Right.
But then, on the flip side, you've got the state of Michigan saying, nope, this case should be thrown out.
So for those of us who didn't spend all those years in law school, what are the Hile families actually claiming here? Like, what's their argument?
Okay, so basically they're saying that even though no one's, directly told them no about getting funding for their kids' education, Michigan's Constitution puts them at a disadvantage right out of the gate. And it's all because they want religious schooling.
So it's not enough to just say, hey, I don't like this law. You have to prove that it's actually hurting you.
Exactly. You've got to have what the courts call standing.
Right. Like, you can't just go around suing about stuff you don't like. You have to be personally affected.
And that's a big part of Michigan's argument. They're saying, look, these families haven't even tried to get funding under the current system, so how can they say they're being harmed?
It's like saying you can't complain that the bakery's out of croissants if you never even walked in the door.
Yes, exactly. But then the families are like, but why would we waste our time going into the bakery when there's a giant sign on the door that says no croissants?
And they've kind of got a point.
Right. They're saying it's obvious. And actually, one judge even called this a generalized grievance, as if to say, tough luck, guys. That's just how the system works. It'll be really interesting to see if the Supreme Court buys that, especially when you consider the historical context here.
Okay, so let's talk about that history, because this phrase keeps popping up. Blaine Amendment. What is that? Fill us in.
All right, so Blaine Amendments. This takes us way back to the late 1800s.
Okay.
Anti-Catholic sentiment was a big deal back then. And this congressman, James G. Blaine, he proposed a constitutional amendment that would basically stop public funds from going to sectarian schools. And sectarian basically means religious, right?
Right.
Now, even though that amendment failed at the national level, a lot of states, Michigan included, they were inspired by this whole movement. And they passed their own versions of Blaine Amendments.
So are you saying that these Blaine Amendments, even though they're like ancient history at this point, that they actually still matter in today's legal battles about religion and funding?
Oh, absolutely. They're like those things that go bump in the night.
Yep.
They just keep coming back.
Like legal zombies.
Yeah, like legal zombies. And that's a big part of what makes Hile v. Michigan so interesting.
Because the Hile families are basically arguing that Michigan's ban on funding private schools, even though it doesn't specifically target religious schools, is basically a Blaine Amendment in disguise.
Exactly. They're saying you can't just separate the ban from, the historical context it came from. They're saying it's rooted in religious prejudice.
But Michigan says, no, our ban is different. We're not singling out religious schools. It applies to all private schools.
Right.
It's about supporting public schools, and that's what the voters want. That's their argument.
Which brings us to another little wrinkle in all of this. Michigan points to this vote that happened back in 2000. Voters shot down a school voucher program. And Michigan's saying that proves that people support the ban on funding private schools. See, and this is where things get really interesting, legally speaking. Does that later vote just completely erase any bias that might have existed in the past? I mean, that vote in 2000, that wasn't a direct vote on the ban itself. It was about vouchers. So it's not that simple, is it?
So Michigan can't just be like, well, the people have spoken, case closed.
It's way more nuanced than that.
Way more nuanced.
And that's where the Hile families are really pushing. They're bringing up this thing called the political disenfranchisement doctrine. Now, this has usually been used in cases about racial discrimination.
Right.
But they're saying that Michigan's funding system, even if it looks neutral on paper, creates a system where families who choose religious schools are basically always behind the 8-ball.
So they're saying that even if the ban itself isn't technically discriminatory in how it's written, the reality is that it creates an unfair system.
Exactly. Like, you can play the game, but we're making the rules and we're going to make sure you lose. It's like they're being told, sure, you can play the game, but we're holding all the cards. And to prove their point, they bring up this case, Hunter v. Erickson.
Okay.
Now, Michigan tries to use Hunter to say that this political disenfranchisement idea, it only applies to race. Like, it has no place in a discussion about education.
Right.
But, and this is a big but, the Hunter case itself, it actually dealt with both race and religion.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was about a housing law that got tangled up in both.
So they're using a case that actually involved religious discrimination to argue against religious
It's
discrimination.
a bit of a head scratcher, right?
Yeah, it seems a little, I don't know, maybe a little ironic.
A little bit. And, it speaks to this bigger debate that's happening in legal circles. Do we interpret laws just on the words themselves? Or do we got to think about, like, the historical context? Like, what was going on when those words were written down?
Because sometimes the context can completely change how you see something.
Exactly. Like one of those optical illusions, The picture's the same, but you can see it in totally different ways.
Wow, that's a great analogy.
And that's what's happening here. Both sides are making good points, but it all depends on how you're looking at Michigan's ban.
So where does that leave us? Like, let's say the Supreme Court actually decides to hear this case. What are the potential outcomes we could be looking at?
Well, if the court sides with the Hile families, things could get very interesting.
How so?
It could completely change how we think about religious freedom and public funding. Imagine a ruling that says, hey, even if a law looks neutral, if it puts certain groups at a disadvantage, it can be challenged.
So it wouldn't just be about school choice then. We could see challenges to things like, I don't know, faith-based charities that get government money.
Potentially, yeah. Or even zoning laws that affect churches and synagogues, anything like that, really.
Wow.
And remember those Blaine Amendments we talked about? A ruling like that could give people a way to challenge those too. And those are still on the books in a lot of places.
Right, right. So this could potentially snowball into something a lot bigger than just one state and one school funding issue.
Exactly. It could even breathe new life into that whole school voucher movement, which has been kind of quiet lately.
Right, right. Okay, so that's if the Hile families win. What if Michigan wins?
Well, if Michigan wins, it's basically business as usual. Meaning states get to decide how they're funding education. End of story, even if some families feel like the system is, kind of screwing them over.
So it'd be like the court saying, hey, we're not getting involved in this. Take it up with your elected officials.
Yep, go vote if you don't like it, basically. And it would definitely make it a lot harder to challenge laws just because they have some kind of, unequal impact in the real world.
So no matter what, this case is a really big deal.
Huge. And you know what else? It brings up some seriously important questions about the role of the courts. Like, should they be in the business of overturning laws that voters support? Or should they step in when they see a law creating an uneven playing field, even if it wasn't intentional?
That's a tough one. Like, where do you even draw the line?
Right. It's a tough one.
But those are the questions we should all be thinking about, aren't they?
They really are. And this whole deep dive into Hile v. Michigan, it's the perfect way to really examine those questions. It makes us think about our own beliefs about individual rights versus what the majority wants.
The balancing act, isn't it?
Always. And this case, it's got balancing act written all over it.
It really does. And, with all this talk about legal arguments and precedents and all that, it's easy to forget about the real people at the center of it all. Like, what happens to the Hile family and families like them while this is all going on? So, what's the big takeaway for our listeners? Even if we don't live in Michigan or, have kids in school, why should we care about this case?
Because it all comes down to a really basic question. How much power should the government have when it comes to telling us what we can and can't, even try to change? We're talking about what we can advocate for. This case, it's not just about school funding, right? It's about whether certain groups can be, totally shut out of the political process just because of their beliefs.
So it's like saying, you've got freedom of speech, but don't even bother using it because we're going to ignore you anyway.
Yeah, it's like, you can talk all you want, but we're not listening. And that's a dangerous road to go down, no matter what side of the aisle you're on. It creates this system where certain voices are silenced, and that's not what a democracy is supposed to be about.
Right. It's like the founding fathers were really worried about this.
Yeah.
The tyranny of the majority.
Exactly. And the Constitution, with all its amendments and clauses, it's meant to protect minority viewpoints from being, completely steamrolled by the majority.
Makes sense.
But, this case shows, even laws that look neutral on the surface can still create consequences that really hurt certain groups.
So it's like this case is, putting the Constitution to the test, seeing if it can really live up to its own ideals of fairness and equal opportunity and all that.
Yeah, it's a stress test for sure. And honestly, that's what makes it so interesting and so important too. Because, look, regardless of what the Supreme Court decides, this whole thing could change how we think about religious freedom, education too, maybe even democracy itself here in America.
That's a lot to think about.
It really is. But if our listeners take away one thing from this deep dive, I hope it's this. Pay attention to cases like this. Even if you're thinking, well, that doesn't really apply to me. These things have a way of, impacting all of us eventually.
Because when it comes to rights and freedoms, it's like we've always got to be paying attention. We've got to stay informed, stay involved.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, we'll leave everyone with plenty to think about. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing, and remember, sometimes the most interesting discoveries come from the deepest dives.